This video will be an overview for the creation and installation of the 2/3 Framerail Replacement kit that I designed for my 88 Z31. I'm publishing this for free to help anyone else that likely has the same damaged frame rails as I did. The disclaimer is that I don't consider myself a fabricator or a welder or a structural engineer of any sorts, so if you choose to follow this, consider it at your own risk. The many sections of this video are a loose documentation of my experience and as such may be incomplete in some details or repetitive in others. It was documented over the span of about 3 months. I think it should still contain enough information to help anyone that may attempt this kind of repair. These templates were copied from frame rails that still had the factory undercoating intact, so they may be 1 or 2 millimeters larger in some areas. I only created the section that I did because it was where the damage on my frame rails was the worst. A full-length template is not something I really plan to recreate. However, as the editing of this video, I still have another anniversary edition to restore, and it has unknown frame rail damage. I'll include a link in the video description to a Google Drive file that has the scanned-in templates that you can print out at home. Feel free to ask me any questions in the comments below, or you can find me on Z31performance.com, username zkarma. Thanks for watching.
So what we have here is the front 2/3 passenger frame rail out of my 1988 Z31 that I've cut out. It was pretty severely crushed in this area here. You can see where it's been fatigued and cracked, and the underside also cracked around in this place here. This was removed and a template was made not from this, but from a frame rail that's in near perfect condition out of my 84 Turbo, and this is the negative of it. This is the positive mold here that I made out of foam core from the dollar store. Basically just tacked it in place over the top and cut it out of sections and then trimmed to fit. And from this white poster board negative was made. And from that, individual panels were traced onto poster board. And from that, this was made. This is 16 gauge sheet steel purchased from local Ace Hardware, made from the templates that I cut out, and fit is close enough. This is the recess for the speedometer cable. This is basically cut, notched, and then welded back in place with a strip of metal in the back there. My welds are not the greatest, but they will function. Nobody's going to see it anyways. But this is basically a functioning frame rail replacement. The only difference is in this section here on the factory frame rail, this tucks up underneath the forward frame, and to remove this you basically have to bend that out of place, and I didn't want to bend that too much, so I left this part out of the frame rail that I created, and this will just ride alongside of that piece, and I'll show you here fitted in a second. This is where the frame rail was removed. Spot welds were just drilled out and the seam sealer was ground back, and where it was cut is about 35 millimeters forward of this edge here. So the rest of the frame rail was in pretty good shape from there back, so I didn't worry about it. The forward part here, where the frame rail is different from the factory, is it, you can see where, I don't know if you can see it, the factory frame rail tucks beneath this lip here, this edge, and to do that you have to fold this back, and I didn't want to fatigue the metal too much, so I just left the feature to where it basically registers on this feature here, and then I'll spot weld it right there. So we got clamps on, got weld through primer holding everything in place. Basically I'm using scissor jacks, Harbor Freight bar clamp at the back, and various welding clamps up front. The weld through primer I'm using is this U-Pol 002 copper This is an idea I came up with. This is basically a big C-clamp where the frame rail is here and the inside of the car on the floor is here, and this pinches them together so that I can get very good plug welds wherever I need to plug weld. So we'll see how that works. Passenger side is done. All the plug welds have been ground back and flush. Seams been pounded up against the floor. The transition there is alright. I left these plug welds intact. And then just kind of bodged that union right there. But part 2, driver's side. It's pretty well smashed in and rusted. I'm going to start by pounding that out flat so I can get to the spot welds and start peeling it off. Alright, it's been a couple weeks since I've even touched this, and coming back to it, try to go over what I've done, or at least what I think I can remember I did. Went through with a wire wheel on an angle grinder and removed all the paint as much as I needed to and the seam sealer. Then drilled out all the spot welds, well, most of them so far. Still got these to do over here, but had to flatten the metal out so I could get to where the spot welds were first. So I cut a seam down the middle to try to give the metal some place to go when I pounded it back. And so I'll just pick up where I left off, drilling out the rest of the spot welds, and this should pop right off. Then we'll straighten this part out here. Probably go up into the car and pound out the floor, try to level it out where it's been pushed up in there. I've also need to get up inside there and remove all that thick rubber sound deadening material, throw some dry ice on that and whack it with a mallet. The carpet's been removed and the driver's seat's been removed. All that's gone. So we'll start there. Only about 30 spot welds later, and it's mostly out. All the spot welds have been drilled through. It's been cut off about yay past that hole right there. Back up in here is where the original frame rail tucks up and underneath this panel of metal here, and to avoid damaging this too much, on the other side I flared this out and then had to pound it back flat after the frame rail was removed. On this one I'm just brute forcing it out and pushing this out. And then on the replacement frame rail kit, I don't duplicate this curve up under here. I just basically end the frame rail right at this spot weld and then just tie it into this piece of metal here with a couple tack welds. All this here will get pounded back out flat and made look nice. Alright, so starting the test fit of the driver's side panel, I've got the bottom panel held in here with some vice grips. Just pinched to the rail on the side there after that's been flattened out. And pinched back down here. Magnets really help keeping these panels in place because they're not, like I said, an exact fit. The patterns were made off the frame rails on my 84, which are in really good condition, but then I realized that they still have all of the factory undercoating and stone chip and seam sealer. So what I'm realizing is these patterns may be about 2 millimeters too large height-wise and possibly width-wise, because they do seem a little wide. And that's probably because the patterns were taken off of frame rails that were coated in all that gunk. So quite a bit of grinding to do. Like up in here, the floor's been caved in from the previous frame rail being all dented up, so I've got to get up there and pound that back. But like the pattern here, I've marked it with a Sharpie, and so I need to grind that out to make this fit a little bit better height-wise, because I'm about where I want to be height-wise for the frame rail. On this side over here, I made a template out of some foam core to try to at least get both sides matching, even if they're not exactly the same. So that needs to come down. It lines up with the side panel, but it doesn't really line up with the bottom panel, so that's got to get bent. And I bent these when they were off the car, so it's completely understandable that they're not where they need to be yet. So basically have to finesse them, grind them, and finesse them some more to get them to fit. Your floor pans may be worse than mine. Alright, just a few minutes later, hit it with the grinding wheel here and made a little bit better fit. Took that material off up there, and it seems to be up against the floor pan a little bit better. Still that gap, but a little bit of an edge right there you can see. I just zipped that off with the cutoff wheel. Like I said, these are a little bit large in some dimensions, so cutting may be required. But that's actually pretty good. It's not tack welded in place, so it's still held in with magnets and clamps, but once those tack welds are in there, it should take that contour pretty well. And made them a little bit long, just to have some extra material for the magnets to hold on to, or clamps, or whatever you're using. So yeah, looking pretty good so far. Gonna go run to the store, get some dry ice, and take out that insulation that's on the floor pan before I start beating on this metal from the inside. Doing some more fitment work on the side pieces. Got the inner side and outer sides clamped in place. Floor gap is a little bit better in places, but I've ran into an oil can issue. So when I go to plug weld it, I've got a very large C-clamp that I sneak in over the door sill and then can clamp basically the edge here from both sides and then do a plug weld. So do a little bit more grinding and fitting. Both sides look pretty close enough anyways. Alright, kind of documenting this as I go along. One thing I ran into on the passenger side was this edge here, which is this seam rail here. It's a separate piece from the side. Somehow on the template, which is this one, this foam core board that I took off my 84, this is the one for the Shiro in 88, which has this extra piece, which I didn't capture, and I'm not sure why, but I'm going to leave it as is. But somehow this curve in the dog leg got a little bit exaggerated, and so that Sharpie mark there is where I've got to trim off material to make it fit against this edge here without being too far off. So this basically has too much of a curve in this area here, and a little bit needs to be trimmed off there. I'm not sure exactly how that happened, but I think I probably tried to, I don't know, adjust for that corner there or that bend, but even the template's not that curvy if you take a look at it. And here's basically the mangled side. So I'm going to start tack welding this in place. Got all the scale ground off of the parts that are going to see welding. Makes the welds pop a lot less and tacks up better if you can remove that. It's like an anodizing almost. It's pretty tough stuff. This steel came from the local Ace Hardware, and so it's got some sort of anti-corrosion coating on it. But anyways, what I'm going to do is put a tack here first and then kind of hammer the metal up into place. I've got this scissor jack attached to a piece of copper pipe, and I'm using that as a helper to hold the metal in place and to also help clamp it up while I tack weld it. The driver's side inner panel is tacked in place. Fitment looks pretty good. Next up will be fitting the outside panel and grinding that to fit, making sure everything is still level, and tacking that in place. Here's the outside of the driver's side frame rail. I basically start in the middle where I know it's kind of right on the edge, and then I'll use clamps and one of these guys to basically get up underneath the metal and pry it out where I need to pry it out, and then just tack it from that point and work my way down to the back and then work my way up front.
So one detail that I failed to capture on video was the actual attachment of the spot weld flanges to the side panels of the frame rails. Basically, once I was content with how these side panels were fitting up against the floor pan, and in some areas where the floor pan was oil canning, I had to estimate the fitment profile. I would tack weld the flange to the side panel and then clamp and use those copper pipe jacks and a putty knife to position the flange in place for the next spot weld, basically positioning and tacking as I moved out from near the center of the frame rail section. I had made a caption earlier in the video that these flanges I'm using were contoured a bit more than they should have been, so they took me some extra time to finesse into place and notch, and took some extra trimming. I think that's why I didn't end up recording it. That shouldn't be required in the new improved flanges in the final template. I ended up scrapping the original flange profiles and created new ones using the outside edge of the bottom panels as a guide, and then extended that profile outward by 17 millimeters for the new spot weld flanges.
Driver's side frame rail up on the bench here, doing some finishing up welding all along the inside of the channel. Got the sides kind of positioned. There's still some positioning work that needs to be done on these front flaps here. Needs to be ground down a little bit. Got the underside welded. Seam sealer will make that pretty. And had to cut some relief cuts in there because my template wasn't that great and it wanted to flare out, so I kind of had to bend it back in. I'll probably do some more work on the flap template before I send it out. Got the tack weld still on this side and the outside, and what I've been doing is, after the inside has been welded, flip it over here, is taking the cutoff wheel and making a notch along here and then stitch welding it back together for extra strength. I didn't like the fact that it was only welded on the inside and then not on the outside. I didn't want any water to get in there and rust or any kind of weakness, so I've been basically cutting back the top piece and then stitch welding it back together. I don't know if that's necessary or not, but makes me feel better. So still got some welding to finish up on the outside here. Actually, no, that's pretty good so far. Got to clean those up, and then where it meets the frame rail that's still in the car, I've got to do some massage work. The part in the car where this meets up is pretty dented, so I had to fillet that open too and pry that up, so that's going to take some kind of blending there. But overall, it's going pretty good. I think I got some good penetration on the welds on the inside, so should be plenty strong. I don't know. Better than what was in there before, so gonna keep at it. So the stitch welding along the bottom is complete. Still some spots where I probably need to go back and fill it in, but it's alright for now. So So the driver's side rail is fully welded. It's been primed with weld-through primer on the welding areas and self-etching primer in the channel. The flanges have been drilled with 5/16 holes for plug welds. The weld-through primer I'm using is a U-POL number 2. This is the local paint supplier's house brand, but it's basically the same thing. It's got the same SKU number for the where the plug welds will be, and that's along the edges, along the inside, and there. I've also used the weld-through primer on the spots of the body where it'll get welded. Probably a little overkill, but that's alright. This part of the original frame rail had to be cut and then re-welded because it was pretty well dented, and I couldn't get this pattern to match the frame rail kit that I welded together. So I basically dropped this corner down about 1/8 of an inch and then just welded it back together and pounded out some other damage underneath here. I think that's going to be good enough. That's where the heat shield for the catalytic converter goes, and as long as that hole's in the right place, that's all I care about. Alright, so we got the driver's side frame rail in place. Looks pretty good. We got these toolkit jacks attached to some copper pipe holding it up against the body of the car, or the floor pan of the car. Still some areas that need to be clamped to snug up the gaps before I start plug welding. But fitment's acceptable. There are still some gaps between the floor pan and the frame rail, but those will be taken care of with the help of a large C-clamp. So here's the big ass C-clamp in action. It's got the frame rail snugged right up against the floor pan that's kind of warped, and it's under a lot of tension. It's basically clamped there. I'll try to sneak video in there. You can see up there, it's clamped against the floor with another piece of 80/20. So that's what that's for. If I didn't have a C-clamp, I don't know what I'd do to snug the floor up against the frame rail. I've already got it up on these jack stands, but that only pushes it up. I need something to push back down, and the C-clamp seems to be doing that. Alright, with the exception of some grinding, that's in. Plug welds are nice and solid. Nice burn throughs on the floor pan on the inside. Smoked the insulation pretty good in a couple spots, but had good penetration. Stitched that together alright. Alright, one last look at the frame rails before I put on some seam sealer. Passenger side is done. Driver's side, I just finished grinding back all the welds on. Plug welds, touching up spots, prepping the metal for the seam sealer. The fitment on it is adequate. It's not as good as the other side, the passenger side, but the welding is much better. I think my welding improved, but I rushed the job slightly, and I'll show you here in a second why, or what the results was. Blending of this into the existing frame rail was alright. Kind of had to add some metal in here and fillet this back to get it to match. There really wasn't a very good transition. I think this piece was damaged. It was certainly dented in back here where the heat shield for the catalytic converter mounts up, and I pulled that out a bit. Not too worried about it. It's all pretty structurally sound, but up here the gap is a little bit more than I would like. My clamp didn't seem to work so well, and when I put the plug welds in, it didn't suck it up, or I didn't have it clamped well enough, but I think it's all right. The fitment over here on the passenger side is much better, probably because I took a lot more time on this one, and this literally I would do a little bit of work and then wait like a week and then come back and touch it again and do a few more things, kind of building up confidence and doing a lot of YouTube watching of other people fabricating things to try to learn what I can before I attempted more of it, more work of this. But fitment on this one is pretty tight. And so what I noticed was after I got this one welded in is took my level here and hold it up between the two frame rails, and over here there's a small little gap between the outer edge and the inner edge, but if you look over here, I've got at least a 3mm gap to where the outer edge of the frame rail is lower than the inner edge. And I think what happened is that, put that level down, when I tacked this in place up in here, I had this pushed up too far and I didn't bother to check whether or not this was tilted or not, so that when I went to then weld on this edge here, this was sitting up too high, and then I just went with it. And I mean, it's no big deal. I'm still really happy with it. It's much better than what was on there before, obviously, but it's just a little disappointing. I mean, this is my first kind of fabrication of anything Z related, or pretty much the largest thing I've tried welding on a car ever. So I think I'll take that as a learning experience and call it good.